And if you look at the incentive structure of an organization of that size, if you allow me to be a bit simplistic, it boils down to two things: maximize turnover and minimize risk.
Yeah.
Right? Yeah. That's it. And so get as much money you can through the system and make sure that you lose as little as possible. Now, some of you may disagree that that is the incentive structure, but I think if you want to make sense out of the conversation we have had today, where on one side we have quite powerful stories that obviously make sense, we have very valid questions of why don't you work with us? Why don't you trust us? What is this? What is that? If you just try to apply Occam's razor and say, okay, maybe it's because these institutions are incentivized to maximize turnover and minimize risk, there's a lot of things that make sense. I don't think that makes the big organizations the bad guys. That I sometimes come across as hating on big aid. That's not my point. I think they're very good at certain things. But I think if we want to square the circle of being able to have the conversation about the tango and the bridge and so on, while at the same time understanding how we can take this to scale and build a meaningful interface between a network and an institution, we need to start with the underlying incentives. And actually today we haven't really spoken about that. We've talked about all the nice stuff and then that we have a problem. But I think we need to go and have that conversation about how do we construct a business model so that we have a value chain that can reach from the bridge to the ECHO grant of several $1 million under very strict audit requirements or anti-terror requirements or whatever the requirements might be. How do you actually do that? How do you handle risk in that value chain? I haven't heard us have that conversation. Now, it's not a zero-sum game. I think it's great that we talk about these things. I'm not saying, oh, this is just small stuff, not important. On the contrary. But we need to have the other one as well. It's not a zero-sum game. Right? And there's no ill will in the system. The vast majority of humanitarians I know that work in this town and across the world are deeply committed people who are as frustrated as we are. There's no ill will. But there are set up perverse incentives that drive us in the wrong direction. And I think we need to put those on the table also. Otherwise, we're not addressing the power in the room. Thank you.
So challenge for the funding panel this afternoon. Please take up this challenge. That's why we want to deepen the, in the panel discussions in the afternoon. So listen up and make sure you include this. Nick.
Sorry, there are quite a lot of people who have questions, so I'll just be very quick on this. No, I think that the emphasis on localization of humanitarian action is positive because now there's a sort of demand placed on large international organizations to explain why they're not doing more. Hopefully that will make some difference over time. It will take a long time. This is a very slow moving system, takes an enormous amount of time to change, and so we just have to hope that works out. I just want to talk for 1 second about this whole trust thing, because what we ask, and we're working in many countries now, we ask a couple of questions which we always used to describe as trust questions. So we ask, do you feel that the people providing you with assistance have your best interests at heart? We thought this was a great trust question. And we always get very high marks on that question. All organizations get high marks on that question. And also they get high marks on, does the people running this program treat you with respect? Again, we get very high marks on that across the world. And if you then dig into the sort of social psychology of that, it's because people hope they have their best interests at heart, rather than having any evidence that that's the case. And the evidence comes from, are your priority needs met? Do you have the information you need? And so forth and so on, practical things. And on those issues, they get very low marks. So I think it's important for people who are trying to build this trust, whether it's between international organizations and local ones or diaspora ones, or with people who are affected by crisis. It's important to really try to understand what are the building blocks of trust. And one needs to sort of dig rather deeper and correlate between different questions that are being asked and the answers that are being provided to get a really clear sense of what's driving people's views.
Great, thank you. Thank you. Yes, so let's have second round. So, please.
Hi, I'm Melissa with the British Red Cross. We've just started a diaspora engagement programme with the British Red Cross, which is quite exciting. But it is quite a new field for us as well. So we're talking to people and we're trying to understand really some of the language that we're using. My question really is, how are you all defining diaspora and then defining diaspora organisation and also being a member of a diaspora?
Paddy?
Thank you. My name is Dr. Al-Banna, founder of Islamic Relief Worldwide and chairman of World Humanitarian Action Forum. My question is not a question because I know most of the panelists, and I'm very thrilled to hear what they have been discussing. But we are facing a lot of problems, which is the culture, the philosophy of thinking, the language of the big boys club, which with good intention, as you mentioned, good intention is not good enough for me because I don't understand them as a diaspora. I don't understand them as local organization. That's why I don't trust them. Good intention is not good enough. So the elephant in the room is that most of our money comes in response to emergencies, actually, not to development or rehabilitation. And my solution, which is my own idea, is we have to lobby a new way of dividing the emergency response fund. 70% for traditional humanitarian response, okay, which will do it very well, water, sanitation, health, whatever you call it. 30% for capacity building of local organization and building community. Otherwise, we'll be chasing our tail ends at every time and everywhere we go. We'll be like headless chicken. And this is what we are facing nowadays. Facing colonization of humanitarian aid, facing maybe militarization of humanitarian aid, and facing whatever we call it. So we have to find a solution. And we have to make the people who made 2016 World Humanitarian Summit accountable for the outcome, and one of which is localization. Localization, localization. Without localization, we'll be going around ourselves like headless chicken, and you can be organizing many conferences, workshops, and summits and others, and we're not going to reach it. Try to look at the funding criteria and pressurize the government to spend at the time of conflict, like the Syrian conflict. Where is the brother Paddy? That's here. 11 years ago. See how many billions of dollars, billions, has been spent in void. And we did not spend half of it, or quarter of it, or 10% of it on capacity building and building local community organization. And we'll be going back and back and back again in Africa and Latin America and all the other countries. We have to find a way, new way of finding a solution of spending the Humanitarian Response Fund. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I think here.
Hi, I'm Elvina Quayson with the ICMPD, and I have a question for Nick. You've spoken about the contribution, or seeking the contribution from affected people to comment on those who provide services from them, be it institutional, diaspora, and so on. But I'm interested to find out what then happens with that contribution, particularly with larger institutions. As Lars was saying, if we come down to the core of it, the two major influences on how other humanitarian responders is more driven by the funders, donors, and governments' considerations. So how do you see this contribution feeding in meaningfully into their work? And then just in response to both Paddy and Cinzia suggesting it would be good to start to calculate the value of diaspora contribution within the development space, an organization called Afford did some work where diaspora professionals were volunteering their time in home countries, and they calculated the value of that time in response to their actual income and were able to come up with a figure. So there are some spaces to learn from that can be used within the humanitarian space and so on when it comes to volunteerism and value. Thank you.
Great, thank you.
Hi, my name is Zora, and I'm coming from Action for Development. It's an organization working in Afghanistan. So I saw there was another voice, but anyway. I have a question related to one of the discussions you had previously, and when we speak about local organizations, diaspora in all the normal situations, completely one thing, but when we speak about diaspora in crisis, in conflict, it's completely, I guess, a different type of policies and need to be considered in that way. But my question was mainly because we see that at the moment there are a huge number of diasporas and organizations that are working, as you mentioned, in opposition to the current de facto government of Afghanistan. And still we see that some donors and some, I would say, governments support the other side or de facto government. When you were speaking about lack of institutional diversity, my question is actually how to get that our donors who fund currently these diasporas and organizations to understand this and consider that there should be institutional diversity within the country and how we can push them to understand this. Thank you.
Last one, and then we...
Hi, my name is Nana Otu Oyote, and I'm coming from an organization called Forward. I'm very interested in hearing from all of you about how we can decolonize humanitarian issues. We've been talking about power, access, diversity. How can we do this, and how can you ensure that diaspora are also very much engaged in all these INGOs? How can we break that cycle of having these kind of silo approaches? So I'd like to really hear a little bit about your thoughts. Thank you.
Thank you. Okay, I think let's go answer some questions, and we'll go to a third round. So, Niels, start us off.
It's Lars, by the way.
Lars, sorry, I keep taking your surname. Sorry,
No,
Lars.
Maybe to pick up on the two questions over here, how can we get donors to fund differently? Maybe that is a unique role for the diaspora. You straddle different civil societies. You have your homeland, you have where you live, and some of the countries you live are major funders of humanitarian action. Maybe you can tell these powerful stories. Maybe you can influence those governments to understand that there is a different way of working. I think maybe that is a very unique contribution that the diaspora can bring. We have spoken a lot about the role the diaspora plays in the homeland. What about the other home? Which buttons can you push there? How do we decolonize aid? It's a very good question. I think we need to start by demonopolizing it, right? And I think, again, my favorite word, coordination, up here. We sometimes tend to want all the pieces to fit together, right? We have to deconflict, we have to coordinate everything. But that also, especially when you have a few dominant organizations and donors, it kills the diversity. Mm. So we absolutely want to decolonize aid, but we maybe need to go through just the diversity. Let's not see diversity as a problem that needs to be coordinated, but as a strength that can actually give us different perspectives and a more robust humanitarian narrative, if you want. I think a lot of it starts there. Thank you.
Thanks, Lars. Cinzia.
Well, so I think there are so many questions about the Red Cross and what you define as diaspora. It's a very complex, I mean, it's not a, but the definition that we use is we consider Venezuelan diaspora everybody who has a link, either legal because has a passport, emotional because has family there, or just because of interest. So we found people who had lived in Venezuela, but who are not Venezuelans, but actually they loved so much Venezuela that they are part of our group. So it's a loose group, but definitely there is an emotional link. I think the emotional link is the most important element in diasporas. Now, how we did colonize? Well, I was at the receiving end of a colonizing British company in Venezuela, and I can tell you it was so irritating. They knew it all. But the truth is that what helped, I think, is a little bit building on Lars. We need to demonstrate that we're capable, that we know what we're doing, and so on. It's not that easy, Lars, though. And you know the beast from the inside. You know the monster. And so probably people like you who can see both sides of the spectrum have an added responsibility to help this dialogue to happen. Because, you know, I think diasporas, we are very, in a way, it's great to be, you know, people pay attention to you, people want to talk to you, people want to engage with you, research you. But at the end of the day, you know, we need help. We really need help. So, and there is, up to a point, you know, very stretched sometimes with demands from information, you know, participation, seminars, etc. But actually, we have to, the time that we're taking to do all these activities that are very important is time that we're taking away from the core, which is humanitarian action. So I think that's something also that organizations like DEMAC and IOM that are very interested and engaged in this need to understand up to which point we as diaspora organizations can really, you know, have the energy and the time to engage in all these activities. So I think we got to a point where now it's there is a momentum, so we need to get into action and
going forward. Paddy.
I think I'll start with Madam Nana, and an avid follower, and great to have you here in the room, here with us. I think some very important work that you've done at Forward as well. And I think your question is really relevant. How do we break that cycle, you know, those silo approaches? I will go to an example of the network of, you know, African diaspora that was supporting third country nationals in Ukraine, fleeing Ukraine rather, and how we decided to break those silos. So the traditional way would obviously be that you would have to contact ministries of foreign affairs, diaspora unit desks, so on and so forth, always having to get to the dean of the group of African ambassadors and so on and so forth. But I think that the uniqueness about diaspora is that we don't have to follow the rules. So that means that the very silos of communication that go between embassies is not what we had to follow. Many times we've had to deal with consuls on our WhatsApp, and then followed by an official email. And if it's really relevant, maybe something goes to a permanent secretary somewhere. But half the time is just saying we will not succumb to the same red tape because there is a crisis on the door. There's a couple of migrants that are stranded in a border somewhere. There's a discrimination case that's happening. There's some issues that are happening that need to be resolved now. There's students that have fled Ukraine that are sitting in a Polish immigration detention center. We shouldn't be spending one more day chasing red tape. So I think that the fact that diaspora dares, and for me then comes to the space in which they operate, which is then where I would say we don't formalize everything, because when you formalize, you would formalize everything. And that would slow up the pace in which diaspora is able to take up. So I think some of these ways that we decolonize is also sort of saying, from also how you provide different needs and support, that you would ask migrants. For a lot of times, a lot of the students and third country nationals were just being ferried to planes. Has anybody asked to say, what would you like to do with your life after you fled Ukraine? Poland gave them 15 days on the territory, 15 days after you fled a war. You should just jump on a plane and go back home. Wait a minute, after 10 days, somebody thought, maybe I want to continue my studies here. Maybe I want to do these things. Diaspora comes in to do the advocacy. So I do agree that sometimes you've got the lazier approach, the slow approach, the quick approach, jump on a plane, go home. Or are you in for the long haul? Can we really not fight the system, but advocate for the system? Advocate with the voice of the migrants in front. And I think the same would apply for work in the homelands in terms of how would we engage. Diaspora would not go in and say, well, there's a drought or there's a famine or there's lack of a food insecurity space. They don't go in to ask the Ministry of Agriculture, can we see your action plan and implementation plan for how you intend to send seed or how you intend to provide needs for people. They just go into the community. So I think that that's part of it, decolonizing that space. But how do we move that evidence up as we are told to formalize parts of these systems, as we are told to show the measure of the impact. And these are the things that I think remain important to feed design and policy. But I was also going to talk about how we then traditionally program. How do we traditionally also evaluate? I mean, Zambia, Zimbabwe, Nigeria, South Africa, on the same continent, we have very traditional ways of how we evaluate impact. Have we listened to local organizations? I mean, how many times do we see international organizations, whether it's for development or humanitarian needs, arrive in a place with a big mission, the big car, everybody comes, there's some dances happening, they're going to show them facility. As soon as they turn back to go, that whole community disappears away from the scene where development has taken place, and we've seen white elephants. Has somebody sat down to look at the lady at the corner selling her vegetables and say, hey, what have you seen about the impact of this hospital being here? She could tell you a lot. She would say, well, you know what? Since the doctors started coming, there are more and more women coming here. Or since this particular change has happened, this is what we're seeing. So how are we also listening into local organization in terms of design and that feeding back? The definition of diaspora is really interesting. And I think Cinzia has given a very good meaning to it. At JRFDT, we have been doing, as a research forum that does a lot of capacity building and speaking to diaspora organizations, but also in the classroom back again, we often then tell students to talk about what diaspora means. And some of them did a paper where they were trying to look at it as a movement, trying to look at it as a concept, but also trying to unpack it a bit wider. You have a lot of African Americans, for instance, who feel that they're part of the African diaspora, and some who may not have that feeling and not attached to it. But we've seen the cases in which people are trying to even to do tests. You could find your lineage back to where specifically you belong into Africa. But then I think that it has many other meanings and diversity. And so the targeting becomes very important. But I would always say, don't get lost into the concepts as well in designing, because it's very easy. And I'm sure, I think I was also even going to throw it back to say that if we had somebody from the academic space who probably would define it for us maybe even more differently, and this changes across cultures and across spaces as well. Thank you.
Thanks. And that definition, I think really important how you define it rather than how others define it, because this is another conversation that's also going on in the localization space, right? Others defining what localization is instead of local organizations defining is very different in terms of what you do and how you move forward. Nick?
Yeah, thank you. Prior to Elvina's question, the big of course, this is what they used to describe as the $64,000 question. I think it's probably a little bit more now. But anyway, how do you actually get action? How do you drive change? That is the sort of missing piece in many instances. Listening is all very well. Learning is great if one can get there. But actually taking action is what it's all about. And that is about incentives, and what is it that will encourage people to do something about the information they've gleaned from the people who are in a position to know better than them for the most part. And without that incentive structure in place, without demands placed upon people running programs of different kinds, it's not going to happen. And without the resources in place, it won't happen either. If you want to create this virtuous circle, you need to have the incentives in place, which include appropriate funding. What's quite amazing to me is that our tiny organization is always being judged on the extent to which people act on the data we provide and the analysis we provide. And Lars Peter's organization also is in the business of providing analysis and data. And then you're judged on the extent to which you've advocated effectively to move massive organizations to do something about it, which is extremely irritating, to put it mildly. And it comes back to this question about how then do you decolonize aid? And if you go back to the origins of the system and after the Second World War in particular, the establishment of organizations with particular sectoral or people-focused children or refugees or whatever, this was to kind of kickstart efforts to make a difference. It was born out of in a just becoming post-colonial era, so they were, I guess, tainted by the brush of that period. But they remain as there was this wonderful book which was focused on the World Bank, but it could apply equally to other organizations, Lords of Poverty. I was flying from Vienna this morning, and there was someone I know from a UN organization who was in business class, and I was flying in, and they were flying in from, I think, from the Far East somewhere. Every donor who contributes to our organization specifically stipulates No one can fly business class ever in your organization. And yet for the UN, it's just standard practice, lords of poverty. And I think that really is an important point, because the only way we're going to bring about the kind of change we need is for people to come a little more humble, a little closer to the realities of people on the ground. And that is impossible if they're so far removed physically when they're traveling, and in every other way, in their large cars and in their air conditioning, etc., etc. And you know, there are lots of ideas around about how do you develop a new governance arrangement for organizations that are trying to do the right thing, and having these monopolies is no longer an appropriate way to organize international endeavor. But it will take a long time. Any time any criticism is made of current arrangements, people then say, oh no, we need to protect what we've got, because otherwise, you know, it'll be worse. I don't think those are particularly convincing arguments. And I think we really do need to spend, you know, the system needs to spend a lot more time. And one of the big problems is that there's complete collusion between donors and the organizations. We have just, a Scandinavian government is hopefully going to fund us now, and they wrote to me outraged, saying, why do you choose to have your headquarters in the most expensive city in Europe? And actually I don't. I'm based in Vienna, which is one of the cheapest cities in Europe. But they were referring to Geneva. Yeah. And they raise no objections to the fact that there are tens of thousands of people who work for UN organizations that are based here. They make no effort to address that issue. Another point on this is that if you look on the Wikipedia pages of senior people in humanitarian organizations, development organizations, they describe themselves as diplomats. Very often they describe themselves as diplomats. They're kind of moving things around a chessboard rather than dealing with real problems and real people. So I think that there's some big issues that one needs to cope with. I don't think I've given any hints about how one might go about doing it, but I sense your pain.
Thank you, Nick. Thank you. And really, just listening to you all, it's all very well saying the system. Who is in the system? It's the people, right? And Niels, I know, Lars, I keep telling you Niels, Lars, apologies. You know, you were saying earlier that, you know, the intentions are good. Actually, sometimes they're not so good. Because we are used to our power and privilege that it brings to work with international organizations. So I think there is something about working on individual attitudes and behaviors, and Nana, decolonization comes from realizing your power and how you use it or abuse it, right? So I think there's that work that really does need to be done to bridge that divide. And at Global Mentoring Initiative, we are